Today's presenter, Russell Jackman, is a graduate of the McGeorge School of Law, University of Pacific, and was admitted to the State Bar of California in June of 1994. He has been vice chair of the California State Bar's Law Practice Management and Technology Committee and a member since 1996. He works specifically with law offices and attorneys that need to get the most out of their legal technology and creates PowerPoint presentations for opening statements, direct examinations, and closing statements to be used in court, and can work with attorneys directly to filter their documents and images so that they have the most powerful visual presentations possible. He also works with law offices and solo attorneys to upgrade their older systems to new ones, troubleshooting existing setups, and training attorneys and staff on Microsoft programs. He is available for remote access consulting on technology-related issues, so please feel free to contact him at any time.
Hello, my name is Russell Jackman, and today we're going to be talking about lawyers and the opioid crisis. It's a subject that kind of meets close to home for me personally, so it's something that I want to talk about with attorneys that are interested in finding more about it and about how it actually applies to them. Certainly you hear a lot about attorneys and the opioid crisis, but it's usually when you go and you look up attorneys and opioids, you find a lot of law firms that are suing on behalf of their clients for opioid addictions. But what there isn't a lot of information about is attorneys themselves and how opioids are affecting them. So in today's talk, we're going to talk about how the opioid crisis has affected the legal profession and attorneys themselves and what can be done about it. So the opioid crisis started, well, it's been around obviously since the days of morphine and morphine dens and opium dens back, going back hundreds, if not thousands of years. Human beings have abused and had trouble with opioids in one form or another, whether it just came right from the poppy plant in the form of opium or was manufactured into things like morphine and then heroin, and then, of course, methadone and other drugs that we've seen come onto the market. So it obviously has a real connection with human beings and how we operate. It's a present. It's always in the background of humanity that this sort of abuse can happen, and especially with opioids themselves. The biggest problem is that the high level of addiction from the opioids creates a huge threat. And then you also have the fact that overuse of opioids can lead to death. And so we've seen that in this opioid crisis that we're going through right now even, that from 1999 to 2010, there have been 450,000 deaths due to the opioid crisis, and that includes the combined statistics of heroin, morphine, and methadone abuse, as well as a lot of other prescription drugs that we'll talk about a little bit later. And in 2010, heroin, which had been declining in numbers, became quote-unquote hip again, and there was the concept of heroin chic. And that really did increase the amount of numbers of people that were abusing heroin and obviously dying from it or becoming addicted to it. And then in 2013, OxyContin and the overuse and overprescription of OxyContin as a pain-relieving drug by many doctors really surged the death count. And as we've seen over time, there have been a number of situations where OxyContin was overprescribed, or doctors were getting monetary incentives by drug companies to get their patients to take more OxyContin than was needed, or prescribed it in a lot of circumstances when other pain relievers would have been almost as effective or been a lot safer to use. And that's obviously something that we're looking at after the fact, but certainly lawyers themselves have been caught up in these numbers too. That it's not just the opioid crisis is something that is not just for homeless street drug people, but is affecting the middle class, it affects the upper class because of the proliferation of OxyContin. So we've seen 3 waves on the rise in opioid overdose deaths. And as this chart shows, per 100,000 people, the synthetic opioids like tramadol, fentanyl, which have really surged in the numbers when you go up to from 2013 to 2018. It just became easier for illicit drug sellers and producers to make their own opioids and to manufacture their own synthetic versions of these items rather than trying to get it illicitly from doctors or from pharmacists that would be willing to sell it to them. So the underground market was really able to make these drugs and way out pace heroin and other opioids such as methadone and morphine. Those are still significant death numbers. But when you look at the fact that you have basically, almost a 5 times or a 2.5 times greater death toll per 100,000 folks in the synthetic opioid area really highlights the crisis. And if you notice, of course, from 2018, the number is going up. And I would imagine in 2020, with the way things are going right now, with the shutdown and the COVID crisis, that this abuse is probably going on an even greater basis because of people's desperation and depression over current world circumstances, as more than ever before. We obviously haven't got the numbers in, but I would not be surprised at all if it got much worse. As we see that from '99, it was really the prescribed opioids had a surge, and the synthetic ones really did not cause as great a problem for almost 15 years. But once we hit 2014 and 2015, you see that incredible spiral moving upwards of how deadly the synthetic opioids have been since then. So what are opioids? Opioids can be prescription medications often referred to painkillers, but they are often street drugs such as heroin. But they are used to block pain signals between the brain and body and prescribed to treat moderate to severe pain. In addition to controlling pain, opioids can make some people feel relaxed, happy, or high, but they do carry a high level of addiction with them. And other effects have include slowed breathing, constipation, nausea, confusion, and drowsiness. Slowed breathing is usually the greatest danger that opioids provide to the people that abuse it, that it shuts down the breathing process, and most people die from suffocation because their respiratory system just will not work when they've overdosed. But then other things such as, the addictive element of it causes people to create more crimes when they're not able to get a hold of any, and the confusion and drowsiness can be a real problem for people that are operating heavy equipment or driving under the influence of these opioids, and unfortunately that's a large number of people. So the most commonly used opioids are prescriptions such as OxyContin and Vicodin, and fentanyl, which is a synthetic opioid that winds up being 50 to 100 times more potent than morphine. And of course, everyone is familiar with heroin. But fentanyl is sort of fentanyl and OxyContin are really the highest demand street drugs right now, if people can get a hold of them, because of the incredible power that it has. It takes very little to get a big yield, and to, you can make a big profit off of fentanyl sales, more than you can with heroin. And because of the fact that it's a pill-based drug, that both OxyContin and fentanyl are pill-based as opposed to heroin needing to be injected, the fact that anyone can take it just by swallowing it instead of having to go through the difficulty with morphine or heroin to actually inject it into a vein and go through the pain and the hassle of obtaining syringes and finding a place to inject. If it's easy enough for people to just grab one or two tablets and just take them down and swallow them every few hours, then that's an easier way to abuse it. And there's so much fewer physical side effects that you can see from someone that's using fentanyl or OxyContin. You don't see the track marks. You don't see the sort of physical damage, external damage that happens when people are using oxy or fentanyl, especially in the early stages of it, whereas with heroin and morphine, there are obviously greater physical signs that people are abusing them. So here's kind of the laundry list of the different types of opioids that are commonly abused, from oxycodone, and that's probably one of the most prevalent ones, to oxycodone acetaminophen, the hydrocodone acetaminophen, codeine, which is only available now in generic form, tramadol, fentanyl, hydromorphone, meperidine, methadone, and morphine. And so there's unfortunately a lot of different varieties available, and probably each and every one of these is abused in some fashion. So the risks that are common with opioid use is tolerance and dependence, requiring a higher and more frequent dose for the pain relief to work, or for the user to experience the euphoria that normally came with the early use of opioids. And in some cases, longer-term use can lead to addiction, or what our doctors are calling opioid disorder. In addition, opioids can restrict your ability to breathe when taking at a higher dose, and when misused can lead to a fatal overdose. And the risk of respiratory depression, slowing or even stopping your breathing, increases even if you've never taken an opioid before, or if you're taking other medications that interact with the opioid. And that's often a huge problem with people who are using opioids, is the fact that they mix it with alcohol, they'll mix it with other drugs, and it tends to be part of a deadly chemical combination that usually is all part of a personality disorder that spirals out of control. And when the opioids themselves are interacting with other diseases, and people are using it to escape the pain, they are sort of getting themselves in like a dual. It's a really terrible spiral downwards where you have people in pain because of disease. They take the opioids, they get addicted, they need more. The opioid abuse that they're doing exacerbates the condition that they already have. So it creates more pain. It needs more opioids that then make the pain even worse when the opioids wear off. And so it's this terrible death spiral that occurs, and it can really strike anyone of any class, including attorneys who don't often think that they're ones that can fall victim to this. Opioid side effects, well, we talked about the tolerance, so needing more pain and more medication to get the same pain relief or even a lot less pain relief. The physical dependence, so you have withdrawal when the medication is stopped. Then when you aren't taking the opioids, you have a greater sensitivity to pain. There is constipation that comes with opioids. Often people will be prescribed opioids with a stool softener or some sort of laxative to try to counteract what the opioids do. They can cause nausea, vomiting, and a dry mouth. The sleepiness and dizziness are, it's kind of a mixed blessing with the sleepiness and dizziness. The sleepiness helps you to be able to sleep when you're in a very large amount of pain. And of course, the ability to sleep is one of the ways the body can heal itself after a traumatic accident, which is something that I will talk to you folks about in a little bit. But it's the sleep that you get isn't always the most perfect sleep that you can get, and that the fact that the depression is part of usually either an accident. So a lot of people start taking opioids because they've been hurt, and so being hurt in an accident already is a depressing concept to begin with. But then you add in the fact that you've got this chemical that is adding its own level of depressing thoughts and moods, and you have no energy, and you're tired, and you're dizzy, and you're nauseous. That also spirals the depression curve further on you when something like this happens. And the other levels of, for instance, lowering in testosterone and itching and sweating are not pleasant either, and those things interfere with your normalcy. And when you're not normal, that creates a greater level of anxiety and depression, which then fuels the need for people to want to take more opioids to try to get over what they're going through. So it creates this kind of horrible, and I keep saying spiral, but the spiral does continue to descend or increase, however you want to look at it. You go down the hole, and it just keeps taking you further down the hole because you don't feel better, and it gave you a good feeling once, but you try to achieve that feeling again. You can't achieve that feeling again unless you take a lot more of the drug, and then the drug itself creates enough problems with its side effects that you're never going to feel great, and when you stop using it, you feel so much worse, which again cycles you into needing more of the drug to try to avoid the pain that you're going through. So in 2016, the American Bar Association did a very large survey and interviewed almost 4,000 attorneys about drug use, depression, and so forth, and alcoholism and all of that. And there were some pretty stunning numbers that came as a result of that, and that 28% that they found during their survey suffer from depression, 19% suffer from anxiety, and 21% were qualified as alcoholics based on their survey answers. There were 3.6 times more likely than other professions to suffer depression, and that the higher rates of suicide were seen with the overall lawyers, I think, are fourth on the list of professions that the people who were involved in it commit suicide. And so there is, and then they also acknowledged that there were about 30% of the attorneys that took the survey simply did not answer questions about drug use or things like opioids and the possible addiction levels there. And so that they thought was also a very high number and kind of an unfortunately telling number that attorneys just don't even want to talk about this issue, and it's not one that is popular among the legal set. And that's why this talk is really important, because the state bars, all of them, have a requirement for talking about substance abuse for your continuing education credits. Every single one thinks that there is a large importance around that. And it's a big elephant that's in the room for a lot of attorneys, yet they don't want to deal with it because there are things in the profession that are barriers to discussion and dealing with it openly. In fact, a lot of people feel that the profession itself drives the depression of the legal world. And co-founder Andrew Winters is co-founder of Cohen & Winters, a criminal defense, personal injury, and family law firm, says that I think that a large basis for the prevalence of depression and substance abuse in the legal industry is self-selecting. Lawyers tend to be driven perfectionists, which is often why they entered such a difficult profession. The demands of clients and supervising attorneys tend to exacerbate what is in most instances a pre-existing issue. So, and that by this quote, he's definitely saying that to become a lawyer, you're already putting yourself at risk because of the nature of the profession. It is a high-stress profession. It is a competitive profession. It's an adversarial profession. It's a male-dominated profession. It's a oddly both a discriminatory against young person profession and discriminatory against older person profession. So there's really just sort of a very small, quote-unquote, sweet spot of when most attorneys are at their highest earning potential, and when they're at the bottom working their way up, or whether they're at the top, you know, waiting to be replaced as a partner or maybe being dismissed by a firm. It's the security and the assuredness that everything's going to be all right, that, you know, their plans and how they expect everything to be taken care of as an attorney doesn't always happen. And so that in itself is a huge stressor that leads towards the kind of depression and motivators to start abusing not just alcohol, but all sorts of drugs. So we see this as a driving factor to use opioids. The fight or flight nature of the legal business, The fact that you have a relentless schedule for most attorneys, the fact, court is always there in the background, and you've got to make it to the court on time. You've got to present yourself, have your case ready. You've got to make sure that you're doing all the things necessary so that you're adhering to the rules of the court. So that the court itself is a very stressful place just to even just show up and appear. It takes a lot of work, and then on top of that, what happens at court can hardly be described as relaxing. Heavy debt loads out of law school, which are really much like medical school and other professional schools, is become out of control. And it's not uncommon for attorneys that start out in their first year to already be a couple $100,000 in debt, or like at least $100,000 in debt. But if they go to a private law school and they're not able to get, help from their family or any kind of scholarships, there's a significant, we're talking certainly like a place like Stanford or USC, you're going to be paying probably in like the $50,000 range per year to go to school there. And so that's a good, $150 just in tuition, and then whatever living expenses you were paying for during that time frame is really going to be so significant that that it already puts a huge pressure on attorneys before they ever step foot in a law firm. And then you could do certainly there could be an entire talk based on the unreasonable law firm demands and competition that goes on in law firms. It's a huge driving force for people that want to escape and to find an alternative to the kind of life that they have in their law office. And even if you're on your own, client demands, regardless of whether you're in a firm or not, anytime you have a client, you can have some incredible headaches based on what their demands are, what they are trying to get you to do for them, and their expectations that you're available to them all the time, that you can answer all of their questions, that you're at their beck and call, and that there are strategic disagreements that you have with clients. It's all part of what is, and then of course, if the clients themselves can't pay or have problems paying for your services after you do all that work, that gets even tougher. Well, and being an adversarial type of profession, you're always in conflict. I mean, obviously you can be a contracts attorney, and there's other types of law that you can do where you're not necessarily conflicting with everything that you do, but divorce attorneys and personal injury attorneys and so forth, every day that they work, they're trying to work counter to some other entity, and that is going to you get that from both sides. Not only are you getting it, as an opposition, say, with an insurance company, but you're also, as we said, getting pressure from your client to get as much money as possible to represent them. And the whole being a zealot advocate is takes its toll on almost everybody that is involved in the legal profession at one time or the other, and depending on how much you're doing it, it can be really a gigantic stressor. Some of the attorneys I know that I've worked with, especially ones I've done PowerPoints for in the past, are perfectionists. They're A++ personalities, and they get so furious over things that cannot be controlled by them, yet their desire for everything to be perfect is a driving force to push the stress to a particular level at which they can't handle it. and their desire to be in control of everything and to have the right outcome always go the way they want it to is a really big issue for a lot of attorneys and leads them to basically blow a fuse, so to speak, and not have the ability to handle some of the stresses that they're under. And then there's no structure to release stress. And yes, there's obviously things people can do to relieve stress, and working out and exercise. It's all very helpful, but for a lot of attorneys, their time is so under the control of their clients and their firms that they don't get that time off. And even though it's offered to them, they don't take it because they're so concerned about having a victorious outcome to their to what their situation is, and they want to show managing partners how hard they're working. They want to show their clients how hard they're working. They want to show themselves how hard they're working, and so they don't take time off. They don't take the breaks they need. They don't ever stop this constant hamster wheel that they're running on all the time. And you know, people say, well, you just should, but that just saying to someone that you should do it without giving them any ability to actually do it is both disingenuous and what leads attorneys to be so frustrated is that they can't. People say, well, you should relax, and most attorneys will say, well, I simply can't because I'm just under too much of a deadline. I have too many cases that I have to do. I have to, you know, work with these clients that are out of control. I have to, you know, I'm trying to make partner, and I need these hours. The billable hours are this constant demon that floats in the background of most attorneys' minds that are in firms, and that they have to be getting a certain amount in on every month and every week, and literally every day. They have to find a way to be accountable for their billable hours and bill whatever they're doing to somebody, and that is a huge stressor that puts them ill at ease on a regular basis. And then weakness or perception of weakness is not allowed, and that might be why we see in those surveys that 30% or between 25 to 30% of them that were filled out didn't have any answers on the drug part of the survey, because even in an anonymous survey, attorneys didn't want to put down the truth of what's going on in their lives, and to even to themselves perceive a weakness was in their minds unachievable. So that they didn't even want to admit that they were ever at any point in time weak, and so they can't admit it to themselves. They won't admit it to somebody else, and that creates obviously a gigantic problem that is not easy to solve. And then finally, you know, the threat of disbarment and discipline hangs over most attorneys at all points in time, and so there's a real fear that by admitting, even though the bars say that all bars have a lawyer's assistance program, and that they have issues where they say that they won't disbar someone for seeking treatment. People don't want, attorneys especially, are too afraid of getting the reputation that they have had this problem, and so they sweep it under the rug. They hope nobody pays any attention to it happening, and they just sort of look around and they see that so many other attorneys are succumbing to these problems that they basically say, well, you know, if attorney X is doing this and attorney Y is doing this, then I'm going to get away with it too because, you know, these other guys have done it for, or ladies have done it for, you know, decades, and nobody's ever caught up to them. So we're going to do that. I'm going to be one of the ones that gets away with it as well. Well, there is help that is available for attorneys. I'm not trying to be all doom and gloom on all of this. There are, as I mentioned, the lawyer assistance recovery programs that are available by the state, and the ABA itself, both on their website and through the association, has national programs that you can be a part of. And then the state bar itself, all the state bars have resources for being able to seek help when you have a difficult situation with addiction or with substance abuse. But probably the most unique organization is one based here in California that is known as the Other Bar. And the Other Bar, which is you can find on the web at otherbar.org, deals with the assessment and referral of attorneys that are having substance abuse problems, including opioids. They provide treatment, and then under certain circumstances, they do provide matching funds in the form of loans to qualified individuals not able to pay the full cost of treatment. One of the biggest problems that we have in this country, and I'm not trying to pontificate too much for it, but I really do think it's a major part of the problem, is that we have a medical system that is run on profit and an insurance-based business for healthcare that makes it very difficult for people who have problems to get the help they need unless they're indigent, because most insurance won't pay for an entire amount of what people need to get the full amount of recovery that is necessary. Yet, often, as we pointed out with OxyContin and fentanyl and heroin and so forth, the addict, the person who's been taking these drugs, has usually spent the money that they have on the drugs themselves before they get to a level where they need treatment. In fact, it's usually the fact that they've run out of money that causes them to seek help in the first place, or to commit some sort of crime to cover the fact that they have spent all their money on an illegal drug. And because of that, for most treatment facilities, they want to get paid for treating someone who is addicted, and that addict doesn't have money, so they go without treatment, and again, the spiral gets worse. They'll say, well, I've got to save my money so I can get my next fix, and since they're working on getting their next fix, they're not working on getting treated, and the spiral continues down. It's really something that I would hope that maybe after the COVID crisis is over, or we've got it under control, we can see that our current health system that we have is not sufficient to treat people in this sort of way, and to rethink how we're dealing with the opioid crisis, to turn it around, and instead of trying to make money off the people who are addicted, to try to help them first and find a way for the government to pay for it, as opposed to expecting people who are victims of the opioid crisis to pay for it all themselves. The Other Bar provides a peer support network, so when drugs and alcohol are involved, mentors who are themselves recovering lawyers or judges are able to talk and listen. They have support groups, so that Other Bar sponsors regular anonymous peer groups statewide concerned about drinking, drug use, or other addictive behaviors. Education and prevention. The other bar works with other firms, law firms, bar associations, courts, and law schools to provide education concerning chemical dependency and recovery. And then they offer MCLE-accredited panels, workshops, and retreats that are tailored to meet the needs of specific participants. As I mentioned, it is a mandatory part of your CLE education, no matter what state, to take substance abuse MCLE classes and be able to get information on a constant basis for get that sort of education on a regular basis every 3 years or so, depending on your bar's requirements, to be updated on that and make sure that you're focusing at least part of your continuing education on the issue of substance abuse. The other bar provided a self-test, questions that you could ask yourself or maybe ask yourself of a loved one that you work with or a coworker that you work with that's in the legal profession, and see if any of these situations are problems that arise to them, such as, are my associates, clients, or support personnel alleging that my alcohol or drug use is interfering in your work? Do I plan my office routine around my alcohol or drug use? Am I fooling myself into believing that drinking at business lunches is really necessary? That's certainly kind of an older concept, but it's still around, and it's still kind of part of the quote-unquote mythos of big firm attorney experience, where you have the peer pressure of going to a big lunch and the martini lunches or at company parties or retreats or social events that people there are drinking and that you want to fit in. I mean, it's the same thing that people went through as teenagers, and it's the sort of thing that happens in law firms too, and that the pressure is even higher when you're talking about people that want to be considered for partnerships and so forth, that you quote unquote are doing what you can to get along with everybody else and to fit in and to toe the line and seem like you're doing what everybody else is doing, even though it's not something that really is for you, is a big problem. And culturally it's changing, but it's not there yet. And there's still a significant number of attorneys that feel pressured at social events to drink or to use some kind of drugs while they're associated with the firm. Do you ever feel that alcohol or drugs, you need them to face certain situations? Do you frequently use drugs alone, alcohol or drugs alone? Because of my alcohol drug use, have I ever had a loss of memory when I was apparently conscious and functioning? Has my ambition or efficiency decreased since I began to drink or use drugs? Do I ever use alcohol or drugs before meetings or court appearances to calm my nerves, gain courage, or improve performance? Do I want or take alcohol, drugs first thing in the morning? Have I misused or adjourned closings, court appearance, or other appointments because of my alcohol drug use? Due to my use of alcohol or drugs, have I ever felt any of the following: fear, remorse, guilt, real loneliness, depression, severe anxiety, terror, or feeling of impending doom? Is alcohol or drug use making me careless of my family's welfare or other personal responsibilities? Does my alcohol drug use lead me to questionable environments and acquaintances? Have I neglected food, hygiene, health care because of drugs? Have I neglected my office administration or misused funds because of my alcohol drug use? Am I becoming increasingly reluctant to face my clients or colleagues in order to hide my alcohol drug use? Have I ever had the shakes, sweats, or hallucinations because of drug use? Do I lie to hide the amount I'm drinking or using drugs? Could disturbed or fitful sleeping be the result of alcohol drug use? And have I avoided important social, occupational, or recreational activities as a result of my alcohol, drug use? And so, you know, they say at the other bar, if you even answer yes to one of these questions, then there's a large chance that you are addicted to something and that you should be seeking help, which is, there's a lot that's covered here. There's a lot of things a lot of questions that are very personal, and it takes a lot of self-realization to answer these things in an honest fashion, and be able to provide therapists or a group or association that you're working with to undo any addiction that you have. You have to be able to answer these honestly and come to a point where you're willing to accept the truth so that you can work on a solution. So now I have to unfortunately talk about my own experience with opioids, because it was not too long ago that I suffered a terrible accident. First, in 2016, I broke my hip and my femur. You'll see the x-rays on the left side. It was all, my hip and femur were all replaced by metal. I was walking down the stairs of my house when it was raining very hard outside, and we were getting about an inch an hour, and my left foot hydroplaned off of the top step of my stairs, and I went straight down and fell on my right side, and my leg bent up underneath me, and it snapped my femur and shattered my hip. And as you can see there by the x-rays, it was all replaced by metal. And it was incredibly painful. In fact, I did not lose consciousness during the fall or during the accident. And so I felt that pain the entire time. And even a quick 2-mile trip to the hospital, I live right across the freeway from it, felt like a cross-country flight across, you know, like a 6-hour plane flight, because it just, every little move, every little jostle that we took created a tremendous amount of pain for me. And the recovery was very slow because of the trauma, and my doctor had said that there was a good chance that I might not even walk again. He said there was about a 50% chance that I would never walk normally, and I knew I was in for a very tough fight. And in the hospital, of course, they gave me OxyContin. I'd never had surgery before. I'd never broken a bone before. I'd sprained my ankle once back in 1988. In the summer of 1988, so that was bad, and I think at that time I'd been given morphine as a pain reliever to get over it, and I didn't take it for very long, so I didn't have any real side effects. But for the pain that I suffered from this accident, I needed to be under. I needed the OxyContin just to survive through the pain itself, the intense pain itself. So I took Oxy for maybe about 2 weeks, and I took it in the concentration that was recommended by my doctor, but I had a terrible reaction to it. It was absolutely the worst experience of my life. It was worse than the pain that I was in for my hip. It gave me terrible nightmares. Just absolutely the worst nightmares that I've ever had in my life. And it really made me want to kill myself. It was, and I'm not talking about that in I just wish I was dead kind of flippant remark. It was really giving the voices inside my head that already were traumatized by the accident and the surgery a huge loudspeaker to shout in my ear constantly, 24 hours a day, but especially when I was asleep, that things would be so much easier for me if I just ended it all. And when that is going on 24 hours a day, and I don't normally think like that. I'm not somebody that contemplates the negative side of things like that. And everyone who was around me said that they just could tell how abjectly depressed I was. In fact, after taking OxyContin and stopping the use of it, I still had nightmares probably going on for another good 6 months after that, and I was diagnosed with PTSD based off of what I'd experienced from OxyContin, and it was just terrible. It was, as I said, worse than the pain itself. And I talked to a friend of mine who'd broken his leg 3 times before, and I picked up the phone and I said, hey, guess what we have in common? And this was after about 2 weeks, and he was saying, and I was telling him about how awful I felt, and he said, well, is it, are you, getting in arguments with everybody? And I said, yes. And he said, you feel like you want to cry at even just like the sappiest commercial in the world? I said, yes. And he said, are you having terrible nightmares when you go to sleep? And I said, yes. He said, it's the Oxy, man. You've got to stop using it. And so through his encouragement, plus the help of other use of I was able to get my hands on some CBD-based medication. I was able to cut my Oxy use in half during that week that I talked to him, and by the next week, I'd stopped using Oxy entirely. And my recovery went much, much, much better from that point forward. Yes, my hip was stiffer. Yes, I went through some painful moments while the Oxy worked itself out of my system, and then I was able to feel, the pain in my hip a lot more. But through Tylenol, through CBD use, through cannabis use, I was able to really get away from the chemical dependencies and the chemical problems that Oxy was causing for me. And that really turned me around tremendously. And I swore that I would never use Oxy again. And I kept to that vow until just recently. This is recording in 2020, and about a month ago during the COVID lockdown, I fell off of a scooter where I was trying to get the exercise everyone is telling everyone to get during the lockdown. And I was on a little scooter with my kids who were just fine on their scooters, and I hit a rock and fell over a curb and fell onto my right shoulder, and I cracked my right shoulder. I broke my right shoulder and cracked a rib from it, and you can see that horrible bruising that goes on in that lovely picture right there. And so the pain was absolutely intense, and breathing was really difficult, and it really was a significant hassle. When I was admitted to the hospital, they gave me 2 OxyContins, and then they gave me a bottle of pills to take home. Well, I took those 2 OxyContin, and I just remembered about all the terrible things that were going on. And even though I took some for the next 2 days, I realized how awful it made me felt, and I cut my usage in half after the first day. And by the second day, because people were telling me how awful I sounded, I stopped using it entirely. And we just went to using Tylenol and the CBD products that I was using before in 2016 to make a recovery. And it's now been a month later, and I haven't touched an Oxy pill since. I have no intention on doing Oxy ever again. And it's proof that you don't necessarily need to take Oxy in order to recover from even a severe injury like a broken shoulder. So I'm not trying to preach to people and say you can take the pain, but I am here to say that there are pain alternatives. You don't have to take Oxy just because you're hurt. Even a severe injury, there are other alternatives. I strongly, strongly recommend that people consider those alternatives before taking oxy, even when prescribed by a doctor. And that brings us to opioid treatment alternatives. And that is, you can, in recovery in 2016, some of the things that I used along with just aspirin and cannabis and CBD, I am with a networking group called the Business Network International, and I have very close relationships with a very trusted chiropractor, massage therapist, and acupuncturist. And between those three modalities, that really helped on my recovery in a non-drug, non-addictive way. No one thing was the panacea. So in other words, massage therapy didn't solve it all for me. Acupuncture didn't solve it all for me, and nor did chiropractic care solve it all for me. But the acupuncture relaxed my system and got it out of fight or flight mode. It got it out of that fight mode where my body was in such a level where even the medications I was taking to help were not helping. I was still very stiff and very hard. It was still very hard to move my hip and my leg in 2016. So I used acupuncture to relax my system up enough so that then the massage therapy and the chiropractic care that I received were able to get in deeper and move my body quicker so that my leg was no longer stuck and my hip was no longer stuck in that position. If I hadn't done the acupuncture, because I tried the chiropractic work and I tried the massage therapy before, and it wasn't having as big a result. It was getting me to a certain level, but not getting me back to normal. The acupuncture really had a large effect in getting me so that I could accept these other modalities of treatment, and suddenly everything started working together. The medication I was taking to reduce the swelling in my joints, plus the massage therapy, plus the chiropractic, plus the acupuncture, all combined to allow me to walk normally again, and that was a huge thing because, as I said, there's about a 50% chance that I wasn't going to be able to walk normally without when the doctor first did the surgery. There is Tylenol, there's Advil, there's Aleve. I think all of those are easier to take, even if you take the. I know that there are issues for the stomach, issues for the liver, and so forth if you take too much of these pain relievers. But if you look at, say, maybe targeting like only a month of usage, and then you start tapering it down. And I really was able to recover over my broken shoulder probably, I'd say, within 2 weeks. And so I cut my Tylenol use down. You have to be thinking that, okay, if I've got this pain, it's terrible, but I'm going to target, a week or 2 weeks or a month, and I'm going to start reducing the amount of pain reliever that I'm taking to the point where I'm not taking it anymore, then that shows you have some control over it. And I can tell you Oxy doesn't allow that for most people. But if you take Tylenol, you take Motrin or Aleve, you'll feel that there's not this overwhelming need for you to keep taking more of it, and that you can see the results of the pain starting to go down, and that the inflammation is not as bad, and that can encourage you to start looking towards stopping it and not needing it, except, when there's something extreme that happens to you, in the future, or you somehow re-injured or something like that. But, and then it all comes down to, I think, once you feel that there are ways that you have met the pain and solved the pain situation, that exercise is a very big element to putting you on the right track, and that you're able to create your own level of endorphin balance. I'm not saying that, you get the runner's high to counteract the opioid high that you get, but with exercise, you do get a certain level of endorphin type relief that comes to you that helps with sleeping regularly, helps with eating regularly, helps with your body's condition so that the stress levels are being released in ways other than chemically. And that can get you back your balance that you need, along with other modalities. I'm not so much for the intervention therapy, such as injections or the medication. Well, the medication for depression or seizures carries its own risk. Certainly for something that would fight the seizures, that would be a big thing. But I was prescribed medication for the depression that I was suffering under with the opioids that I took, and it seemed to me to be counterintuitive to take medication to get over medication. And so I chose, after a short treatment of that, to stop that and instead try these other modalities, and they worked for me in a successful way. So if you haven't tried that, or somebody that is going through something like this and they have maybe not tried a combination of acupuncture, massage therapy, and chiropractic care, they might at least want to give it a try and see if it's something that can be done, because then your body is working on naturally healing itself instead of depending on another chemical to get over the chemical that you're going through. But whatever it is, you've got to find a way to get off of opiates, because opiates really have only one ultimate ending to it, and that is, well, there's only two real things that can go on when you're hooked with opiates, and that is, one, you'll be broke, and two, you'll be dead. And neither one of those alternatives is acceptable. And so I think it's upon every attorney that hears this talk that may be suffering from the grip of opiate addiction to find the help that they need. And I do hope that this lecture inspires anyone who is suffering to turn their life around and be able to get away from the horrors of opiate addiction. Thank you very much for listening today.